Does calling ace high for $11,500 on the river look crazy? Well, the solver does think so. But then again, not really. This would be a call, sometimes, 4% of the time. But what does that mean for you in practice? Are you supposed to know this for every hand you play and then just randomize? Well, today we're gonna look at something that you can actually apply when faced with uncomfortable bets. Small blind versus big blind single raised pots are some of the most difficult ones to play. That's because ranges are really wide. On a super dry flop like King 8-3 Rainbow, that means that the advantage that the small blind's open raising range had before the flop is still there. Since the big blind would 3-bet most of his best hands, his calling range is much weaker than the small blind's opening range, which includes all of these. So with a consistent advantage across his entire range, a small bet with almost his complete range is the best play for Marcus. And that bet gives Linus at least some difficult decisions, because against it, he would not only have to find 12% of raises with pairs, so King X, 8X and 3X, and hands like Jack 7 suited, 9-7 off and Ace Deuce off, he would also have to find calls with hands like 10 Deuce suited, 6-7 off or 10-7 off, just to not overfold and let Marcus make an instant profit on a small bet. He does call and we see a 6 on the turn. Here, the solver would split the betting range into an overbet with top of the range hands like top pair and better and ace high and worse, and a small bet with pretty much a mix of everything. Since we saw that Linus's range would still include some very weak calls on the flop, a small bet could still clean up quite some equity by folding out complete airballs like 10 Deuce suited or a Jack 9 off. But it would also allow Marcus to get another round of value with his Ace 8, which could get called by a lot of weaker 8x, 3x, 6x and even Ace and Queen high hands that the solver would still call here. But he does decide to check, which is also a fine option. And now, Linus goes ahead and bets 150% pot. A polarizing bet like this would only happen with strong pairs and better. For the solver that would be King 9 and better, 2 pair and sets, and complete air, so anything worse than ace high. For those, we see that the solver prefers hands with nut equity, so straight draws, 10-9, 10-7, 9-7, 7-5, 5-4 and 4 deuce, but also some queen high hands are in there, presumably because they block some King X hands in Marcus's range and can also serve as bluffs on rivers that complete a lot of the straight draws. And for Marcus, that means that ace 8 is a clear call. A pair is of course ahead of all of the bluffs in Linus's range, but it also blocks value hands like sets and 2 pair, which is a big factor when the value range is so narrow like in an overbet spot. But not every pair, not even every 8 is a call. What makes the difference here is the ace. An ace makes this hand a better hand to call with because it unblocks bluffs. Since the big blind would almost never bluff an ace here, having an ace ourselves means our opponent can have more bluffs in his range. And the same logic applies on the river. Facing another bet, pot size this time, the solver says ace 8 is good enough to call here most of the time. But that just scratches the surface. As we can see, the optimal strategy for ace 8 here is mixing raises, calls and folds, which means the hand is indifferent and every one of these actions has an EV of 0 big blinds. And that means that any little deviation from the equilibrium strategy that the solver calculated for our opponent can instantly change whether ace 8 becomes a highly profitable call or a highly unprofitable one. So let's have a look into what's behind the solver's output, which is merely a door to a dark and unexplored world. Hello? Are you still there? Great. So as you'll know, solver results in general are way too complex for any human to actually apply in game. So instead of looking at this simulation, taking away that ace-8 is a call, and not having a clue what to do when a different situation occurs, we'll look at two principles that you can apply to any situation like this one. For that, we'll look deeper into our opponent's frequency, so how many hands are value bet and bluffed, and their range composition, so which hands are value bet and bluffed. The most important thing to look at is always the frequencies we're up against. How often is your opponent bluffing and how much is he value betting? Because if you know these frequencies are off, everything else often doesn't even matter. You don't need to think about blockers if your opponent is highly over bluffing, because every bluff catcher already becomes a profitable call regardless of blockers. But of course, most of the time, you don't know if they're over bluffing or not, so you have to estimate it. And for that, you want to take the baseline of what the optimal strategy for the big blind would be, and how much room there is for him to deviate. Here, the big blind would be betting around 36% of the time in theory. 70% of those would be value bets and 30% would be bluffs. But when we look at the bluffs, we see that the hands the solver would choose to bet are only a fraction of those hands that could potentially bluff here. Just looking at queen high and worse hands that got to the river, we see that only 20% of those would actually bet. Those would be the lowest ones, so 4 deuce suited and 4-5, which would never win at showdown. But if you bluff anything else on top of that, you would already be over bluffing. Which means in terms of frequencies, the sensitivity of whether ace-8 is a good call or not is very high. And in this case, just from availability of hands, the likelihood of the sensor swinging towards over bluffing is higher than a tendency to underbluff. But even if we didn't know that, or assumed our opponent would get their frequencies about right, there is something else we want to look at when bluff catching. As mentioned before, ace-8 here blocks a lot of value hands, 2 pair in sets, and doesn't block any bluffs because Linus shouldn't ever bluff ace-x. And both of these assumptions are very applicable in reality. In a minute we'll look at an example where that is not the case. But here, it's very reasonable to assume that not only end bosses like Linus, but most decent players on lower stakes as well, will rarely, if at all, bluff ace-x, but take their bluffs from weaker hands. Which means ace-x is very unsensitive to the big blind's range composition in this spot, and will always make a good bluff catcher in that regard. Both of which shift this 0 EV bluff catcher to more likely being a plus EV call. Again, we see the small blind open. On mid stakes, this spot would be clearly under 3-bet by population in practice, so you could actually open wider from the small blind than GTO suggests. For a complete breakdown of population's tendencies in all preflop positions, check out Preflop Exploits. In there, you'll find a full report of exploits for every spot that you can apply preflop to make more money on mid stakes. The big blind calls and we see another king high flop. As in the last hand, a small c-bet on a king high board is again the solver's choice. And again, the big blind would have to call pretty wide. Just that against this 30% pot bet, he could fold a few more hands. So that the only non-obvious hands to call with here are limited to some backdoor flush and straight draws such as Jack 8 or 10-6 of hearts, and 9-8, 6-8 and 6-5 with a spade. On the turn, an overbet would again be an option for the small blind. And in this case, that's what Dejan actually goes for. For Daniel, top pairs and better have a rather easy decision, as they could always continue. Second pairs are a bit more difficult, as calls and folds are mixed. But at second glance, we see the clear tendency that queens with lower kickers are mostly called, and those with higher kickers are mostly folded. Which makes sense when we see that a big part of the small blind's overbet bluffs are Jack 10 and a few other Jack, 10, 9 and 8x hands. So higher kickers block bluffs, while lower kickers unblock bluffs. Third and bottom pairs can only be called when they have an additional flush draw, or when their kicker is an ace, because similar to the hand before, those again unblock the most amount of bluffs. And lastly, he could call almost all his draws, which means not only flush draws, but even open-enders, so Jack 10 and 6-8. Missing our flush draw, we just want to check. We could even be good against a lower ace-high draw or another missed flush draw that doesn't bluff. Or we could face a bet. And again, even though this hand is mostly a fold for the solver, our hand is practically a 0 EV bluff catcher. So any small deviation from the perfect strategy in reality could make this hand a clear call or a fold. So let's look into it. Starting with the frequencies again, we'll see that a bet would happen in around 39% of the time. Of those, 67% would be value bets and 33% would be bluffs. In this case, some top pairs would also be good enough to value bet alongside all two pairs. But the big difference compared to the other hand can be found in the bluffing region. Here, the amount of potential bluffs that are actually betting is much higher than before, because 75% of hands worse than ace high would bluff on the river. Only some Jack 10 off combos would refuse to do so and give up. Everything else is betting. So the potential for this spot to be overbluffed in reality is much more capped. The big blind would have to bet close to all air hands that got here, which includes all missed heart and spade draws. And missed flush draws are generally not the most popular bluffs, because they block missed flush draws in the opponent's range, and therefore minimize the amount of folds you can expect. So while overbluffs can definitely happen in this spot, there is simply much less room to do so in this spot than in the one before. So let's try to get some help by looking at the composition. The GTO composition of bluffs for the big blind is almost easy. Bluff every hand except for most Jack 10 off with a spade. But how likely is that to happen in practice? In reality, a player might just choose to never bluff a missed flush draw, for reasons just mentioned, and always bluff Jack 10. Or always bluff backdoor flush draws and never bluff front door flush draws. Or the other way around. Now, even disregarding the effect that this would have on their frequencies, it would heavily impact the value of our bluff catcher ace-8 of hearts. Theoretically, a player could get their frequencies completely right, but not the composition. And if he always bluffs hearts and never spades, our ace-8 of hearts is a terrible call. So opposed to the other hand, our hand here is extremely sensitive to our opponent's composition and the hands he chooses to bluff with. The special thing in this hand is just that all hearts would in theory always bluff anyway. So for Daniel, given this range that arrives at the river, it is not possible to overbluff heart combos. Which means the only way to deviate this composition that is relevant to ace-8 of hearts is to underbluff heart combos. Which would then of course turn our hand into a great call.
Please put me to bed and turn down the light.
Wir werden geboren und schon rinnt unser Leben dahin wie die Körner in dieser Sanduhr. Der Tod immer unausweichlich vor uns. Unser Schicksal nichts als eine Verkettung von Ursache und Wirkung. Im Licht und im Schatten.
Hold down your hands, give me a sign, put down your lies.
But of course, bluff catching isn't the only thing you want to master as a player. So watch this video next to learn what makes you more money when you're value betting.